you're a new church plant.
That's right.
How did you sense the call to do that, and how did you end up here? And tell us about, in your words, the last 4.5 years.
Yeah. Give you the quick version of events. I grew up in the St. Louis region. I went to college at Washington University, which is 2 miles up the street from this church. When I was in college, I didn't know I was going to be a pastor, but my then girlfriend, now wife, we went searching for a church because we wanted to attend one. We both grew up in a small town, kind of outside of St. Louis, and we just sort of expected that we'd come down to the city and there'd be big churches because everything else was big, big buildings, big neighborhoods, great restaurants. And what we discovered is that every church that we went into, especially in the city, that their best days were behind them, or at least that was the story that they told. And it was really hard for us to find a church as college students that was compelling. And we weren't looking for an all-young church or anything, but we wanted a church that we could just connect with, and we couldn't find that. So that was the first time that the seed was planted, really. And looking back, I remember thinking, if I can't find a church and I want to go to church, I like church actually, there's no way that people who are indifferent toward the church, or even worse, angry toward the church, are ever going to make their way back. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So I just remember thinking about that. Well, I decided to go to seminary after my 4 years of college, so I went straight to seminary. I went to Emory University in Atlanta. Upon graduation, I was appointed as an associate pastor at Webster Hills, which is a church about 5 miles away from here in the suburb of St. Louis. I was at the time the youngest seminary-trained Methodist pastor in our state. I was 24 years old, and so I would get asked a lot, why are there no young people in our churches? And I thought, well, if I get asked this so much, maybe I ought to learn a little bit about it. And so I started learning about it, and certainly realized that my church, although it was a vibrant church, did not have people in its 20s and early 30s, that a lot of the stories that we were telling ourselves weren't true anymore, meaning that, oh, people go away to college, they'll stay away, but if they get married and they have kids, they'll start to come back. Well, all that was true up to the they'll start to come back part, because they weren't coming back, at least not to our churches. So I started thinking about that, and I started thinking about the friends that I had in the St. Louis area who I was in relationship with. They listened to me. I could speak into their lives, but they were not going to come to the church that I was serving. And so I started a Bible study just for some friends of mine, people kind of around my age. My wife and I did it in our home. And that little Bible study just kind of grew. And as it grew, I started to sense that God was calling me not just to be a critic or an observer or an analyst of what was happening in the church, but to actually respond in some way. By this time I had learned so much about what was happening. We were closing about a church a year in the city of St. Louis, just a lot of churches in decline. I heard a lot of excuses about why people weren't going to go to church anymore, that St. Louis was too Catholic, too diverse, too liberal, too rich, too poor, too many other options. I just heard the gamut, too many churches. And pretty soon I realized that those were not true. I mean, those were just false arguments. I began to notice that there was a lot of young people choosing to live in different neighborhoods in the city, asking really serious questions about their life, what to do vocationally, who to be with relationally, what their commitments were going to be politically and socially and theologically. I mean, just people who were curious and searching and asking great questions and trying to find places where they could, find answers to those questions. So I knew that the problem really wasn't with people, it was with me, my leadership, the church that I served. And so I just felt like God was calling me to respond in some way. And so as I began to figure out what that response would look like, I began to consider starting a new church, and some people encouraged me to think about that. That was not on my radar screen in seminary. Methodism in general at the time was not thinking strategically about starting new churches. That's changed a lot in the past 5 years. They're thinking very strategically about it now. And we certainly weren't thinking about pouring resources into city centers. We were thinking about fast-growing suburbs. This area is not growing. Overall, it's not growing demographically. It's changing, but it's not growing. And so these places were not on the radar screen. So that's really the answer, kind of how that call emerged. So I went to my bishop and I said, I want to start a new church. I want to do it in the city of St. Louis. I'd like to create a church that's compelling for new generations of people. Will you let me do that? And I heard a lot of critics, a lot of people who thought it wouldn't work, a lot of people who said you'll never have the money, young people aren't going to give, people don't want to go to church, I mean, just everything. But my bishop, Bishop Robert Schnase, who's an amazing man, we sat down to lunch, and I remember just saying to him, I know this can work. And he said, okay, we're gonna do it. I'll appoint you to do it. And so he appointed me to start a new church. We didn't have any people, didn't have a name, didn't have a location. I didn't have a house to live in, but I was going to start a new church. So it really was, in that sense, kind of starting from scratch. Now, the Methodist Church did give us grant money then in the beginning to get started. I started sharing that vision with some of the people in my Bible study and other people that I had known. And about 12 to 15 people, it was funny because they said no building, no name, no location, no people, no money. Okay, that sounds fun. We'll go for it. And so kind of 12 to 15 pioneer type folks who said, all right, we're in, let's try this out. So we started meeting every other Sunday night. We started with studying the book of Acts, praying together, dreaming, talking about our church experiences in the past, talking about why our friends don't go to church, talking about St. Louis and what we thought it needed and where the opportunities were. And we just started shaping what this community would look like. In the summer, that was in the spring of 2006, in the summer, there was this old church building that was abandoned, closed down. We received it, and so we decided that's where we would launch the church. And then on September 17th in 2006, a little less than 5 years ago, we had our first worship service. Now, I remember that our denominational leadership had some guidelines for churches, and they said, if after 3 years you don't have 120 people, we're not going to be able to continue this. It has to be self-sustaining, which at the time the wisdom was about 120 regular worshipers will get that done. It's probably gone up by now, but and I remember thinking, okay, it's not about numbers, it's not about that, but if we don't have 120 people in 3 years, who knows where I'm going next. So that was always lingering in the back of my head. And I like to say that we had 128 our third week of worship, and that was the lowest number we ever had. And so they said 3 years, it took 3 weeks, and that wasn't a testament so much to what we were doing, but to what God was doing and to the need in this neighborhood. So that was exciting. So ever since then, we've experienced really rapid growth. I think that's surpassed most people's expectations. We now have 3 worship services on Sunday, 9, 10:45, 6 p.m. We will be launching a second site later this fall, about 5 miles away. We already have a 4th worship service that happens there. Between the 4 worship services on a Sunday, we'll have, I think the past couple Sundays we've had around 700 people between all the services. So that just gives you a little picture of what's happened in 4.5 years. That's I'd say the medium length story. But
why do this? Why is it important? What is it that drives you in your faith, gospel message to do church?
Yeah.
But a lot of people say church isn't relevant anymore.
Right. Well, that's a great question. Well, I realized that it's not in my nature, and I didn't really realize this till I got into the church, but it's not in my nature to sit around and serve something that doesn't actually mean what it says. And I was in some churches, I think, that they didn't really mean what they said, whether it was about the importance of what they were doing, the God that they were worshiping. Like if these things were really true that we were singing in worship, that we were saying at people's baptisms, then it all has some implications for how we live. And so, to say that church isn't relevant anymore just strikes me as bizarre for people in the church to say something like that. Then I wouldn't be in this if I didn't think it was relevant. So I knew it was relevant. So then that led me to say, why then are people not coming, especially younger generations? And I think it's easy to lob blame at them, but I realize it's actually the way that we enact church. So to get to your question, I believe deeply in church and the idea of church, the power of Christian community and local churches, but I thought that the way that we were practicing and living out and enacting the church, it just wasn't working anymore. And so that meant that we needed to try some new things. I ended up deciding that a new church was the best place for me to try new things, because I really felt like what it was going to take to reach people in their 20s and 30s in St. Louis was more than we were more than a few tweaks away from reaching 20 and 30-year-olds. And I go and speak now to a lot of existing churches that want to know, how can we reach new people? How can we reach younger people? And I tell them, I think that's a great goal, but I've never met a church that's just a couple tweaks away from reaching new people. Just kind of tighten this up a little bit and get a guitar and worship and adjust the time and you'll be fine. I mean, it really takes a rethinking from the ground up. So I believe in the power of the gospel. I love my friends in St. Louis, and I love the city. And I just believed that the power of the gospel and the people that I loved, I needed to unite those two. And that's what my ministry has really been about.
What is the gospel to you?
Yeah.
Jesus says, go out, teach, baptize, make disciples.
Right.
What is the gospel?
Well, it's certainly those things: teaching, baptizing, making disciples. What I've found is the most powerful articulation of the gospel here in St. Louis. And I'm giving disclaimers here, because I think, again, part of the tradition, the mainline denomination that I'm a part of, that you're a part of, we've not always done a great job of answering what is the gospel. What we found to be a powerful articulation of the gospel is simply this, that the people in this city, people in the neighborhoods, people that I know and love, people that work around here, they know their life is not a few tweaks away from being right either, just like the church isn't a few tweaks away from reaching young people. And they're ready to hear the message that they've sinned, that they're not near as good as they think they are, that their attempts to try to hide the fact that they're not near as good as they think they are also pretty weak, but that despite that, God has sent Jesus to save us, to lift us up, to heal us, and to empower us to live lives of authentic meaning and purpose. And that's the gospel and the power of the gospel in this place.
So it's not just rescuing people from hell when you think of evangelism?
No, it's not that. I would venture to say that it's not been that for probably at least 100 years in the mainline tradition. So a little hell talk, though, is actually not bad. We do that sometimes. Not telling people they're going to hell, but actually exploring it a little bit more, I think. But no, that's certainly not my definition of evangelism.
Let's go back to your Sunday school class that just started growing. How did that happen? I mean, people don't just, transport themselves into the room. Somebody gets them there. Something gets them there. Tell us about that network and that message that drew them.
Well, I'd say there's two primary ingredients there. You have to have an experience that's worth inviting somebody to, and then you have to have people that are willing to invite.